At 1:30 on January 30th, 1944, 767 Rangers from the 1st and 3rd Battalions stepped off near the Anzio beachhead and filed into a drainage ditch leading towards Cisterna di Latina. No talking, no lights, only the wet slap of boots in mud and the faint rattle of equipment. Compass bearings guided them. The sky gave nothing. Somewhere ahead lay a small Italian town and, according to Allied estimates, only a thin outpost line of German defenders. The mission on paper was straightforward. The Anzio landings days earlier had put tens of thousands of Allied troops ashore behind the Gustav Line, but the beachhead was shallow and vulnerable. To turn the landing into a breakout, someone had to seize key road junctions inland. The Rangers were told they would infiltrate several miles through what intelligence judged to be lightly held ground, reach Cisterna before dawn, seize it by surprise, and hold until armoured units from the Corps linked up in daylight. For the first 3 miles, it looked as if the plan might work as briefed. Columns moved in single file along the Mussolini Canal and its drainage ditches, sliding past German listening posts undetected. Scouts stepped over wire and irrigation cuts by feel alone. Leaders checked watches and compasses, corrected bearing in low murmurs, and kept the columns moving. Behind them, the firepower of an entire corps waited for the signal that the town had fallen. Then, just short of the objective, reality broke away from the map. The ditch simply ended. Between the Rangers and Cisterna stretched open ground, planted fields, drainage lines, almost no cover. Dawn was beginning to show in the east. Staying put meant being caught bunched up in the low ground once full light came. Moving meant gambling that the last few hundred metres could be crossed before the Germans fully reacted. They chose to move. As the leading elements pushed out of the ditch, German sentries spotted shapes against the lightening horizon. Alarm whistles cut the air. Machine guns opened from multiple directions. Within minutes, the cough of tank engines joined the fire, turrets swinging toward the fields. The Rangers had not slipped through a weak screen at all. They had walked directly into the main concentration of German infantry and armour in the sector, including elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and 715th Infantry Division positioned for a counterstroke against the beachhead. That so many guns and vehicles had been arrayed to crush a force of fewer than 800 men was not coincidence. German command had learned by experience and report that these American troops could not be treated as a routine patrol. To understand why their presence triggered such a reaction, the story has to leave the drainage ditch and step back to a different coastline, a different year, and a problem the US Army could not solve with ordinary infantry. By early 1943, the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had already shown how effectively the Wehrmacht could use terrain and concrete to slow an army. From Salerno northward, German units dug into terraced hillsides, stone farmhouses and monastery heights, creating defensive belts that turned valley floors into killing zones. The Gustav Line south of Rome, anchored on Monte Cassino, became the clearest example. Strong points linked by machine gun fire and covered by mortars and artillery on carefully plotted grids. Standard American divisions were not weak. They brought 105mm and 150 howitzers, engineer companies, Sherman tanks, and air support. But their method of fighting was built around set-piece assaults. Infantry formed up, artillery laid a barrage, tanks advanced along whatever roads or tracks existed, and riflemen moved out behind them. It was a pattern that had worked in North Africa's more open ground. In Italy, it ran into narrow valleys, switchback roads, and stone positions that survived bombardment far better than planners expected. German commanders knew the rhythms of that kind of attack. They watched for the pre-assault shelling, counted the minutes, and waited in dugouts until the fire lifted. Then, machine gun teams and panzer grenadiers moved back into rehearsed firing positions, catching infantry as they tried to cross open ground or climb slopes with little cover. Each attack gained a few ruined buildings or a ridgeline at the cost of hundreds of casualties. Meanwhile, British experience pointed to a different model. Since 1940, small raiding forces known as commandos had hit coastal installations in Norway, France, and the Mediterranean. Operating in companies rather than divisions, they moved at night in small craft. Climbed cliffs, staff officers had written off as impassable, and struck radar sites, gun batteries and fuel dumps from directions defenders did not expect. Their successes did not make large formations obsolete, but they showed that well-trained light infantry could achieve effects out of proportion to their numbers. In Washington and London, senior officers recognized the gap. Nowhere on the US Army charts was there a unit designed specifically for that kind of work. No formation whose normal tasks involved long night approaches, silent infiltration, and close-range assaults without heavy artillery behind them. Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall endorsed the idea of creating one and tasked officers such as Brigadier General Lucian Truscott, then US liaison to British Combined Operations, with working out the details. Truscott proposed a battalion-sized experimental unit that could be attached to larger formations as needed. Its name, chosen deliberately from colonial frontier warfare, reached back to Rogers Rangers of the French and Indian War. Volunteers would be taken from regular divisions, trained to a far higher standard, and expected to undertake missions that ordinary infantry could not. On paper, it was just another line in a planning document. In practice, it was the first step toward fielding a unit that German reports would soon single out by name.
If you're enjoying this documentary, please like the video and share it with fellow World War II enthusiasts. Hit subscribe as well. Your support really matters and keeps this channel moving forward.
The experiment that would eventually change how German officers judged American infantry began far from any battlefield, in the damp barracks and windswept fields of Northern Ireland. It was early 1942, months after Pearl Harbor, when the US Army quietly circulated a call for volunteers for a new kind of unit. The notice was vague: hazardous duty, high physical standards, no guarantees of assignment, but it drew men from every corner of the divisions then stationed in the British Isles. Farmhands from Iowa, steelworkers from Pittsburgh, students from the West Coast, and soldiers restless with routine infantry training all stepped forward. More than 2,000 applied. Fewer than 600 would be selected. Their commander, Major William Orlando Darby, seemed at first glance an unlikely architect of an experimental raiding force. A 31-year-old artillery officer with a West Point background, he had no commando pedigree and no prior experience with unconventional warfare. But senior officers noted his discipline, calm under pressure, and ability to force excellence without theatrics. Those qualities mattered more than prior specialization. Within days of receiving orders, Darby began moulding the volunteers into a provisional battalion, issuing strict marching schedules, weapons tests, and expectations that would become the unit's culture. By June, the battalion was aboard ships bound for Scotland and the Commando Training Centre at Achnacarry Castle, a place that had already established a reputation among British troops as gruelling, uncompromising, and occasionally deadly. For the Americans, it was a shock. Forced marches over uneven highland terrain began before dawn. Packs weighed in around 80 pounds. Rifles and ammunition added more. Instructors, many with combat experience in Norway and coastal France, corrected mistakes without gentleness. Obstacle courses wound through mud, icy streams, and tangled scrub where live rounds cracked inches overhead. The training philosophy was simple: replicate the psychological conditions of battle so thoroughly that combat itself would feel familiar. Night navigation exercises taught men to move by compass and terrain features alone, without flashlights or shouted commands. Cliff-scaling drills drove home the need to attack from unforgiving angles. Amphibious landing rehearsals emphasized speed over comfort. Cold waves and rain were constants, not exceptions. Hand-to-hand combat instruction focused not on stylized moves, but on lethal efficiency, quick takedowns, silent kills, and coordinated team movement in darkness. Some men discovered during these weeks that they could not keep pace. Exhaustion, injury, and the realization of what the unit demanded winnowed the ranks. When a trainee died during a live-fire assault course, killed instantly by a ricocheting round, the message became even clearer. This training was not theatre. It was an uncompromising preparation for missions where hesitation meant failure or death. By September, about 500 men remained. They had endured conditions few American soldiers had experienced and absorbed techniques that would redefine US small unit tactics. On paper, they were still designated as infantry. In practice, they had become something very different: light, fast, aggressive formations conditioned to attack where other troops hesitated. Soon, Allied planners would trust them with missions that needed exactly those qualities, and in a few months, German officers would begin documenting encounters with these Americans in language noticeably different from the reports describing regular infantry. Months before the full battalion ever saw its first independent operation, a small detachment of American Rangers was already heading toward one of the most controversial raids of the war. On August 19, 1942, Allied High Command launched Operation Jubilee, the assault on Dieppe, a heavily fortified French port held by the Germans. The main force consisted of Canadian and British troops, supported by tanks and naval fire. But about 50 American Rangers, still technically trainees, were attached to British commando units to observe, assist and gain combat experience under real fire. The raid unfolded with devastating clarity. As landing craft ran onto the shingle, machine gun bursts from cliffside positions tore into the first waves. Tanks bogged down almost immediately on the rocky beach. Communication lines fractured under smoke and chaos. Yet on the flanks, where smaller commander groups moved to eliminate coastal batteries, a different kind of battle played out. Here, the American Rangers got their first taste of the work they had been trained for. Under British commandos seasoned by earlier raids, the Americans advanced along narrow paths cut into the terrain, slipping behind German gun positions that dominated the main beach. These were not sweeping assaults, but knife-edge actions fought at close quarters. The Rangers helped flank key emplacements, climbed steep approaches, and supported breaching teams as they lobbed grenades into hardened firing slits. In these pockets of fighting, the commando parties succeeded where the main assault faltered. Several German coastal guns were disabled or destroyed, throwing local defences into confusion and preventing even greater casualties among retreating Allied forces. But the cost was heavy. Among the dead was 2nd Lieutenant Edward Lusterloh, who became the first American ground combat fatality in the European theatre. Others were wounded or briefly captured before withdrawing with the surviving British commandos. For a largely unknown American unit, Dieppe became a baptism marked by violence, loss, and the first hints of a reputation still forming. More important than the tactical details were the impressions recorded by German defenders afterward. In their after-action documentation, German officers noted that some of the raiding troops, among them the Americans, displayed unusual aggressiveness and pressed assaults even under unfavourable conditions. They observed small teams pushing forward despite casualties, engaging at ranges where defensive advantages shrank. The Germans did not yet know these soldiers were the vanguard of a new American formation. But they took note. Dieppe was a disaster at the operational level, but for the Rangers, it sparked the first recognition, among friend and foe, that these volunteers, trained in Scotland's storms and hardened by live-fire drills, were not simply copying British methods. They were beginning to demonstrate the traits that would define them repeatedly: speed, adaptability, and a willingness to close with fortified positions others avoided. As the battalion regrouped in Scotland, Dieppe's lessons circulated quietly. Larger tests awaited, and in North Africa, they would get their first chance to prove what a full Ranger battalion could accomplish on its own terms. When US forces launched Operation Torch on November 8, 1942, the Rangers finally stepped into a mission that was wholly theirs. The target was Arzew, a small Algerian port whose coastal batteries commanded the approaches to key landing beaches. If the guns remained intact, they could sweep the sea with fire and shred landing craft before infantry ever reached shore. Planners chose a different solution. Send the Rangers in first. No bombardment, no armour, no preparatory fire. Just the kind of silent infiltration the unit had been created to master. Shortly after midnight, 2 Ranger companies approached the dark coastline in small landing craft, each boat manoeuvring without lights. The sea was rough. Spray blew across the bows, and the only guidance came from compasses and the faint silhouette of headlands against the weaker glow of the sky. When the craft grounded, the Rangers disembarked quickly, moving inland through scrub and sand before the sound of engines could betray them. Their approach routes had been studied, memorized, and rehearsed. Each fire team knew its path through the darkness. The attack on the northern battery began with a silent climb. Rangers scaled walls and embankments, slipping past sentries whose attention was fixed seaward. At the signal, grenades arced into firing pits, and steel doors burst inward under rifle fire. The the surprise garrison surrendered almost immediately. To the south, a similar assault unfolded, fast, loud, and over in minutes. By the time French Vichy defenders understood what was happening, both batteries were in American hands. The invasion fleet, still miles offshore, would come in unopposed. Arzeu was a small action, but it demonstrated almost every element of the new unit's doctrine: night infiltration, rapid concentration, close-range assault, and immediate exploitation. It also gave Allied commanders something they had lacked: proof that specially trained light infantry could achieve objectives without the heavy casualties usually associated with breaching fortified positions. Weeks later in Tunisia, the Rangers were given another mission, this time far inland at a place called Sened Station. The outpost sat on high ground defended by Italian troops. A frontal attack would require artillery and take hours. Instead, Darby ordered a night march through rocky hills that had not been fully mapped. The battalion moved in darkness, each man loaded with weapons and grenades, their progress measured by compass and terrain memory. At dawn, they emerged behind the outpost and struck from multiple directions. The defenders, caught completely off guard, surrendered or fled. 11 were killed, 11 captured, and the Rangers withdrew before German reinforcements could respond. Only one American was wounded. These operations did not change the campaign by themselves, but word of them travelled quickly. Allied officers noted an efficiency and precision unusual for newly formed units. German and Italian prisoners spoke of attackers who appeared suddenly, coordinated movements without visible signals, and closed quickly before defensive fire could build. In northern Tunisia, German staff officers flagged reports of aggressive American raiders operating with tactics that resembled British commandos but with a distinctly American rhythm. Faster, more direct, and willing to engage at ranges where individual initiative mattered more than pre-planned formations. By the time maps shifted towards Sicily and Italy, the pattern was already forming. Where nighttime movement, surprise, and violent short-range action were needed, Rangers were the instrument of choice, and German troops who had faced them in isolated raids began marking their presence as a warning worth passing up the chain. Some ground in North Africa seemed designed to resist attack. The hills near El Ghatar in March 1943 were among them, steep, rocky, and crowned with German bunkers whose fields of fire swept every approach. 2 American infantry battalions had already tried to take the key height overlooking the valley, only to be driven back by crossfire and timed artillery. Maps labelled the position as formidable. Officers privately called it impossible. When Darby received the mission, he studied the terrain and found its weakness, not in its guns or its trenches, but in the belief that no one would attempt a night climb over the reverse slope. Under cover of darkness, the Rangers began the ascent. They moved without lights, stepping across boulders and loose scree, climbing with hands as much as feet. The route was brutal. Steep ridges, narrow cuts, unseen drop-offs. Packs caught on jutting stone, boots scraped against rock. Men moved slowly to avoid dislodging anything that could give them away. Yet by dawn, they had positioned themselves above the German line, behind it, oriented toward the rear, of bunkers designed to face only the valley. When the attack commenced, the effect was immediate and decisive. Grenades dropped into firing slits, rifle fire raked trenches that had no cover from their blind side, and German defenders scrambled to reposition weapons not meant to turn fully around. Within 2 hours, the hill was in American hands. The victory opened a corridor for Patton's advancing formations and demonstrated that terrain labelled impregnable was often only impregnable to predictable attacks. The next major test came in July during the invasion of Sicily, when the Rangers landed at Gela ahead of the 1st Infantry Division. Their mission was to seize high ground overlooking the beaches and neutralise coastal defences before the main force landed. Landing craft came under fire as they approached, and Italian pillboxes on the bluffs opened up with machine gun bursts. Yet once ashore, the Rangers moved quickly through firing lanes, clearing bunkers in close combat and taking the port by morning. But Gela's true test came after sunrise, when elements of the Hermann Göring Division counterattacked with tanks and infantry. 46 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks pressed toward the beach, trying to roll up the American foothold. Rangers had few anti-tank weapons, bazookas, grenades, whatever they carried, but they used every fold in the terrain to get close, firing at point-blank range and directing naval gunfire from offshore destroyers. By the end of the engagement, 17 German tanks lay destroyed or burning around the town. The counterattack had been stopped by a handful of light infantry and naval shells landing with deadly precision. German analyses from both Elgeter and Gela noted patterns that would recur again and again. American raiders who attacked from unexpected directions absorbed casualties without losing cohesion and closed rapidly to ranges where heavier weapons mattered less. By the time Allied maps pointed toward mainland Italy, German planners were advising frontline units to expect Ranger infiltration anywhere night and terrain permitted, even where doctrine insisted movement was impossible. The warnings were not always heeded. Soon, on a quiet Italian coastline north of Naples, they would be tested again. The ambush at Cisterna did not create the fear German troops associated with the Rangers. It merely confirmed every suspicion they already carried. But the scale of what unfolded on January 30th, 1944, left a mark deeper than any earlier clash. In the months leading to Anzio, Ranger battalions had carved out a reputation across the Italian front. They had seized mountain passes during the Salerno landings, climbed steep ridges to unhinged defensive lines, and held ground against repeated assaults that would have broken conventional units. German reports repeatedly noted their unwillingness to disengage, their tendency to launch unexpected counterattacks, and the difficulty of predicting where they might appear. That reputation shaped the German response long before the Rangers stepped into the drainage ditch. At Anzio, the Allies sought a decisive move, something that would turn a fragile beachhead into a breakout. The concept seemed straightforward: infiltrate 2 Ranger battalions behind German forward positions under cover of darkness, seize Cisterna before dawn, and hold until mechanized units fought their way up. But Allied intelligence underestimated the scale of German reaction to the landings. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had ordered a rapid concentration of forces, infantry from the 715th Division, elements of the 4th Parachute Division, and armour from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. In effect, a defensive wall had grown overnight around the very ground the Rangers were marching toward. The initial infiltration went smoothly. The Rangers passed within meters of enemy positions without raising alarms. Darkness, noise discipline, and months of training worked exactly as doctrine prescribed. Yet when the drainage ditch ended and the open fields began, all assumptions collapsed. A few hundred meters of bare earth, faintly illuminated by early dawn, separated them from their objective. As the leading companies advanced, a single sighting by a German sentry was enough to unravel the operation. Whistles pierced the air. Machine guns opened from prepared nests, stitching lines of fire across the field. Within minutes, tank engines roared to life, their silhouettes emerging from concealed positions on Cisterna's edge. The Rangers scattered into whatever cover they could find, drainage ditches, shell holes, farm buildings, but they were already encircled. German infantry pressed from multiple directions, tightening the perimeter. Attempts by the 4th Ranger Battalion to break through were halted by minefields and coordinated fire. Efforts by the 3rd Infantry Division stalled under German artillery and anti-tank defences. Ammunition in the trapped battalions dwindled rapidly. Grenades were spent. Bazookas fired their last rounds. Rifles ran on single cartridges scavenged from fallen men. Small groups continued fighting long after the situation became hopeless. Some attempted local counterattacks to buy seconds of breathing room. Others held positions cut off entirely from command. German accounts later remarked on the stubbornness they encountered. Pockets of resistance that fought until overrun at bayonet range. Men who refused to surrender until physically incapable of continuing. When the battle ended 8 hours later, only 6 Rangers made it back to Allied lines. Hundreds were killed or captured. The 1st and 3rd Battalions ceased to exist as functional units. German officers studying the engagement afterward noted something striking. Despite overwhelming firepower, it had taken a full morning to crush fewer than 800 men armed mostly with light infantry weapons. The reports reinforced an existing judgment within the Wehrmacht that Ranger units required disproportionate force to contain or destroy. Even in disaster, the Rangers' refusal to fold solidified their place in German threat assessments. And as surviving Rangers were reassigned to rebuild new battalions, The lessons of Cisterna ensured that the next generation would carry forward a reputation already firmly etched into enemy memory. By the summer of 1944, the word Ranger meant something precise to German commanders. Small but highly trained assault units capable of appearing on ground thought inaccessible. That understanding would be tested dramatically at Pointe du Hoc during the Normandy invasion. The rocky headland, rising nearly 30 metres above the English Channel, housed casemates originally believed to contain 6 155mm guns. From that position, German gunners could command both Utah and Omaha beaches. Neutralising those guns before the main landings was essential, and planners assigned the task to companies D, E and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. As the assault craft approached shortly after 0700 on June 6th, German defenders opened fire with machine guns and mortars from positions that hugged the cliff edge. Rangers disembarked into surf churned by shell fire and sprinted across a narrow strip of stony beach. Rocket-propelled grapnels launched upward. Some ropes caught, others fell short or were cut by German fire. Men climbed anyway, hand over hand digging into mud-slicked rock while debris and explosives rained down. Those who reached the top engaged defenders at close range, clearing trenches and shattered bunkers in violent, fast-paced bursts of combat. Then came the revelation. The casemates were empty. The guns, moved inland days earlier, sat in an orchard camouflaged and ready for use. Ranger patrols located them quickly, disabled their traversing mechanisms with thermite grenades, and returned to reinforce the perimeter. But the hardest test began only after the objective was achieved. German counterattacks struck repeatedly, probing the shrinking Ranger lines. Ammunition dwindled, casualties mounted, and by the evening of June 7th, fewer than half the original attackers remained fit for combat. Yet they held until relief finally arrived on June 8th. Later that year, in the Hürtgen Forest near the German border, Rangers took on another mission, assaulting Hill 400, a steep, heavily fortified rise that had resisted multiple attempts by larger American units. Thick woods, icy wind, and interlocking bunkers made the hill a natural fortress. The Rangers attacked before dawn, climbing the slope under fire, breaching trenches in close combat, and taking the summit in a fight that lasted hours. German counterattacks crashed against the new American line repeatedly, and though the Rangers suffered severe casualties, they maintained control of the height until relieved. Throughout Normandy and the later drive into Germany, interrogations of captured soldiers revealed a consistent thread. German units noted that Ranger formations demonstrated a willingness to accept casualties to reach decisive ranges. They attacked from angles heavier units avoided, ravines, wooded slopes, cliff faces, and often at hours when most forces were stationary. Commanders adjusted defensive plans accordingly, assigning more men and more firepower wherever Ranger units were suspected. A single battalion might force German staff to prepare as if an entire American regiment were approaching. After the war, the battalions raised during 1942-1944 were disbanded, yet their methods and spirit endured. When the modern 75th Ranger Regiment was created in the 1970s, it adopted not only the name but the ethos that had defined its predecessors: strict training, night-focused tactics, and the expectation that difficult missions would be accepted rather than avoided. On the cliffs of Normandy, in the forests of the German frontier, and along forgotten ridgelines in Tunisia and Italy, the ground still bears faint traces of the paths they carved, places where small groups of determined soldiers forced an enemy to rethink its assumptions. The men who fought in those battles did not view themselves as extraordinary, yet to the opponents who faced them, they were something unmistakable, a threat that demanded respect, caution, and at times, fear.
If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.